It's day 4 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers. Today we get what might be the best modern merfolk from the set so far, a big-butted turtle, and a card that is almost certainly going to be good in Soul Sisters. Let's discuss. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Wilds of Ixalan spoilers, and we have a ton to talk about today. This set is so ridiculously awesome, we better jump right into it. Start talking about sweet new cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you want to pre-order some of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Lost Caverns of Ixalan. So first up today, we got a new rare merfolk, which I think might be one of the best Eternal cards from the set. Also probably pretty good in Standard too, in Tishana's Tidebinder. So Tishana's Tidebinder, 3 mana, 3/2 with flash. It says when it enters a battlefield, counter target activated or triggered ability. If the ability was from an artifact, creature, or planeswalker, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as it remains on the battlefield. So Tishana's Tidebinder, at first glance, it's a stifle on a stick, which might not seem that exciting. Yes, you can like flash it in and get a fetch land, and that's going to be pretty sweet, kind of building your own blue stone rain. The thing that makes this card so exciting, though, is the fact that if you counter an ability from an artifact, creature, or planeswalker, that permanent not only loses the ability you countered, but it loses all abilities for as long as it remains on the battlefield. So level 1 for this card, you can like flash it in and counter an Atraxa trigger or an Itali trigger. That's pretty sweet, but it's even going to be more powerful against some permanents that stick out on the battlefield. Like, for example, your opponent goes to the Wandering Emperor or something. If you flash in Tidebinder and counter the trigger, the Wandering Emperor does nothing for as long as Tidebinder sticks out. You can flash this in and stop a wedding announcement trigger and erase all the text on wedding announcement. Rafine goes to do this huge conniving thing. You flash this in and counter it, and now Rafine doesn't have any abilities. It shuts down Sheoldred. You counter one of Sheoldred's drain triggers or life gain triggers, and suddenly Sheoldred's just a 4 mana 4/5, no death touch, no abilities. Chromehost Siege Shark stops incubating. Fairy Mastermind stops drawing cards and doing all the things that it does. So this actually hits on a ton of different things, like a surprising number of the most played cards in Standard. Once you get back to older formats, this card becomes even more impressive, in part because in older formats, Merfolk is actually a deck that you can play, and it might be in Standard now too because of this card, with the new additions that we're getting from Ixalan. But in Modern, let's say, you can flash this in and stop a Bowmaster forever. You can get rid of Ragavan's decks. So good against the One Ring in Modern, in Historic, whatever format you're playing it in. Your opponent goes to like draw with the One Ring, or you can even do it in response to the enters the battlefield protection trigger, counter that triggered ability, and then the One Ring doesn't do anything for as long as this takes out. It works against the Evoke Elementals. You can stop Fury's trigger if you're playing a Merfolk deck, or Solitude's trigger. So I think this card is going to revolutionize the way Merfolk play. So the challenge of this card is Merfolk tends to be a really Lord heavy aggro deck. The problem is being a really Lord heavy aggro deck isn't necessarily a great place to be. In a world of Furies and Solitudes and One Rings and Bowmasters, like, it's a tough sell to be like, I'm just gonna dump my hand of creatures and hope for the best. So I'm very curious to see if this leads to a more controlling style of Merfolk. Maybe Merfolk moving forward isn't so much a, I'm gonna dump every Lord possible and try to beat you down really quickly and just like cross my fingers that you don't have Solitude or don't have Fury. Maybe it's more of like a Merfolk control deck. We've seen some of these decks around the fringes that are like almost mono blue Sevulan Merfolk control decks, where your plan is to like win with Sevulan. You got tricky stuff like Merfolk Trickster, and now Tishana's Tidebinder is a great new addition to this archetype. Back it up with some counters and removal, and instead of flooding the board with a ton of creatures, you play a fewer really powerful, sneaky, almost like rogue-like creatures or fairy-like creatures, and play this like tempo-y flash game plan with Sevulan kind of backing it all up, generating card advantage, protecting your team. That's where I think Tishana's Tidebinder is going to shine. Also in Commander, like, just play it. It's going to be good in Commander. One Ring's good in Commander. There's fetch lands in Commander, so it's great in any Merfolk deck in Commander as well. So Tishana's Tidebinder, one of my current picks for best constructed cards from the entire set. I think this is a card that makes Merfolk potentially a thing in Standard. I think this might change the way Merfolk are built in Modern. This card is definitely going to see a lot of play across formats. It is really strong. Just a stifle mode, whatever, like that's fine. But the fact that you can stifle something essentially forever and get rid of all of its other abilities turns this card from like a okay kind of like fillery Merfolk into an all-star that I think is going to be a staple in a bunch of different formats. We also got a new 2-drop Vampire Scout in Amalia Aguirre. So a 2-mana 2/2 legendary Vampire Scout. It has Ward of Pay 3 life, so a bit of protection. 3 life, you know, isn't going to keep it on the battlefield most of the time, but it's going to make it hurt a little bit if your opponent wants to kill it. And then it has a pretty interesting ability. Whenever you gain life, it explores, and then if Amalia's power is exactly 20, destroy all other creatures. So explore, you probably know what it does. You get to look at the top card of your library, actually reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, you can put it in your hand. Otherwise, you get to put it on the top or into your graveyard, and you get a counter on your creature. So why is this card so interesting? Well, this is kind of a weird life gain payoff in the vein of a Johnny's Pridemate or Voice of the Blessed. I think Voice of the Blessed still might be the best version of this effect, but I think Amalia is just like straight up better than a Johnny's Pridemate. So if you want to do the Soul Sisters thing, I think this is a really easy new addition to the deck. Every time a creature TBs, you're gaining life with Soul Warden and Soul Attendant. This is exploring, this is finding action, this is getting huge. Maybe eventually it actually gets to 20 power and wins the game. So if you're playing a Soul Sisters style deck, I think this card is a really powerful new addition. Also, the Explore ability works really well with Abiding Grace, which has become a super popular addition to Soul Sisters. Soul Sisters tends to play a lot of 1-drops, so Abiding Grace's ability to repeatedly reanimate something that costs 1 mana is actually really powerful. The Explore ability on Amalia is going to let you take in mill over 1-drops to reanimate with Abiding Grace, so actually synergizes a lot with Soul Sisters in arena formats like Historic or Explorer, and especially back in Modern. I think we also might have the pieces to build a deck like this in Standard, so I was looking at what we have in Standard. Because of the canceled rotation, we actually still have a lot of life gain synergies. We now have Amalia to join Voice of the Blessed, so we have these 2 really strong 2-drops. Lunarch Veteran, basically a Soul Sisters. LSL Core, basically a 2-mana legendary Soul Sister. Gumdrop Poisoner becomes a really good removal spell if you're a deck that can gain a lot of life. So I'm curious to see if maybe some sort of white-black life gain aggro style deck can actually emerge in Standard, with Amalia being a big part of it. The other thing that's worth noting about this card is there is a pseudo-infinite combo with Wild Growth Walker. So Wild Growth Walker, this was an all-star last time Ixalan was in Standard. A 2-mana 1/3 that says when a creature you control explores, put a +1/+1 counter on it and you gain 3 life. So if you can get Amalia and Wild Growth Walker on the battlefield and either explore or gain a life, you're going to start this like sort of infinite loop. Wild Growth Walker will gain you life, which will trigger Amalia to explore, which will trigger Wild Growth Walker to gain you life, Amalia back and forth. It's not truly infinite because eventually Amalia is going to get to 20 power and wrath away the best of the board, but you're going to gain like 60 life. You're going to get a 20 power Amalia and probably just one-shot kill because Amalia is going to blow up all the other creatures. So as long as Amalia isn't summoning sick, you just swing in with this 20 power creature, kill your opponent in 1 attack. This is going to be interesting to see just how strong this is. So in formats like Historic and in Modern, there's a bunch of infinite life gain based combos that might just be better than this. On the other hand, I don't think there's a easy, cheap, efficient, collected, companyable life gain combo in Pioneer and Explorer yet. It's possible that maybe Amalia Wild Growth Walker is that combo. So I think this could create a brand new archetype, at least in Explorer and Pioneer, and you could definitely mess around with it in older formats as well. So Amalia, I think the card's actually good in Soul Sisters. I know every set I say something's good in Soul Sisters, but this card I think is legitimately good in Soul Sisters. Maybe we get a Soul Sister deck in Standard out of this. Worst case, certainly going to show up in older formats in Soul Sisters, and it's got the cool combo potential. We also got a really solid new removal spell in Get Lost. So Get Lost, 2-mana instant, it's a white card. Destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. Its controller creates 2 map tokens. So map tokens, artifacts you can sack for 1 to make target creature you control explore, only as a sorcery. So this compares to Fateful Absence, but I'm pretty sure this is just an upgrade over Fateful Absence. Fateful Absence blows up a creature or planeswalker, and your opponent, or whoever controls it, I guess technically, gets a clue token. So I was trying to figure this out, which of these is better, and I'm pretty sure 2 map tokens is worse than 1 clue token. So the biggest difference here is map tokens don't always do something. Like, a clue is always going to be good. If you're playing aggro, if you're playing control, doesn't matter, being able to pay 2 to draw a card, always a beneficial mode. Get Lost makes map tokens. Map tokens require creatures on the battlefield to even activate, and then once you activate them, some percentage of the time you're going to draw a land. The rest of the time you kind of like surveil and get a counter on your creature, which is a less powerful effect than drawing a card. So I think if you were playing Fateful Absence, you just play Get Lost instead. This is just a better version of Fateful Absence, and we haven't even really talked about how it also hits enchantments, which is a nice upside with like Wedding Announcement running around or whatever in Standard. So that's a nice little bonus as well. So Get Lost, I mean, nothing revolutionary here or anything. It's just a really solid 2-mana white removal spell, but this card I think should see a lot of play in Standard at a minimum because it's pretty flexible and the downside isn't that much compared to Fateful Absence. We also got a new turtle, which I kind of have a love-hate relationship. So Bedrock Tortoise, 4 mana 0/6. It's a turtle. It says as long as it's your turn, creatures you control have hexproof, and then each creature you control with toughness greater than its power assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So even though this is technically a 4 mana 0/6, it's actually a 4 mana 6/6 that also gives your creatures hexproof during your turn half the time, so your opponents could have to play inefficiently, cast their instant speed removal at sorcery speed or whatever. You're free to like cast your pump spells, not worry about getting blown out, equip your equipment, whatever you want to do. So Bedrock Tortoise, I think this card's actually really strong. Like 4 mana 6/6 is pretty legit stats. The thing I don't like about it is its abilities worded in a way that it's like, there's no downside here. Think of like Doran the Siege Tower, one of the most iconic creatures with this effect. The 3 mana 0/5 that makes each creature assign combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. The thing about Doran is, it's actually like a cool deck building challenge, because if you're playing a bunch of high power, low toughness creatures, Doran's actually kind of a drawback, because it's going to reduce the power of your creatures. So you really want to build a deck where you're playing a bunch of like super low power, super high toughness creatures. Bedrock Tortoise is kind of like the new never feel bad formatting of this ability, where you don't have to do any cool deck building. You can just jam it in any deck and it's going to be fine. If your creature has higher power than toughness, whatever, Bedrock Tortoise just doesn't care. It deals normal damage. But if a creature happens to have higher toughness and power, then you get extra damage out of it. So I really dislike the flexibility of this card. Maybe it's just me being a boomer and whatever. Like, I get it, old man yells at the cloud, all that stuff. But I kind of like when cards have a bit of a drawback or a little bit of a challenge in deck building, rather than just doing everything in all situations all the time. But that aside, this card's pretty legit. I mean, if you look at Magic's history, there's not a lot of 4 mana 6/6s that don't have a huge drawback. If you think about 4 mana 6/6s that do exist, it's like Nullhide Ferox, which makes it so you can't cast non-creature spells. Nylea, really strong card, but it's not even a creature unless your devotion's high enough. Haunted Wumpus, probably the most hilarious of the drawbacks. When it ETBs, each other player gets to put a creature from their hand into play. Bedrock Tortoise doesn't really have a drawback, like not at all. It's like all upside. It's a 4 mana 6/6 that has an upside of maybe dealing extra damage from your other creatures if they have higher toughness and power, and it's going to protect your team half of the time. So I think just based on raw stats, Bedrock Tortoise feels like a very legitimate card that should see play. I was looking at other green threats in Standard and thinking, okay, does this actually do anything with other cards? Like, is this just a 4 mana 6/6 that gives hexproof sometimes? And it kind of does. Like, Armored Scrapgorger is a 0/3. That's a card you often want to play in some sort of green ram style deck. Shigeki also shows up. It's a 1/3. So with Bedrock Tortoise, all of a sudden these are 2 mana 3/3s instead of 0/3s and 1/3s. It grows Pelucranos by 1. It turns into a 5/5 rather than a 4/5. So there are other green cards that you would just incidentally want in your deck that Bedrock Tortoise is going to help power up. Also worth mentioning, there's some cool tricks with this that we've seen with other toughness butt fighting style cards, with one of the best being Tower Defense. Tower Defense One of the things when it comes to Magic design is Wizards has to be careful with cards that pump power aggressively, because they just straight up kill people. On the other hand, if a card is only boosting toughness, Wizards can actually put a lot of toughness into it, because most of the time this is only going to be used on defense. Like, getting extra toughness, it might save your creatures from, combat or removal or whatever, but it's not going to get in more damage. So it's card like Tower Defense, 2 mana, creatures get +0/+5 until end of turn, actually becomes absurd absurd in a Bedrock Tortoise deck, because Bedrock Tortoise can make your creatures deal damage equal to their toughness, so this is kind of 2 mana instant speed. Your creatures get +5/+5 until end of turn, which is an absolutely ridiculous card that Wizards would never print. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't think there's a tower defense style card in Standard, no like massive toughness boost instant that's cheap and easy to use, but keep an eye out for it. Remember, we got 3-year Standard now, so if something along the lines of tower defense shows up in Standard in the next like 3 years or whatever, Bedrock Tortoise could become even better. As far as Commander, I think this is basically like a butt fight card. If you're playing Doran or Rashad or maybe Arcades, even though Arcades kind of cares about defenders, so it's a little awkward. But if you're playing a deck that's built around having creatures deal damage equal to their toughness rather than their power, I think you just throw this in. I mean, 4 mana 0/6 is what you want. Anyway, it's another way to do your butt fighting shenanigans. I guess it could also show up in a turtle deck. I don't know if turtle decks are really a thing in Commander, but if you do somehow make a turtle deck, you'd probably play it there as well. So Bedrock Tortoise, no downside here, which makes it a much more powerful card, even though, for me at least, it makes it a slightly less interesting card, but I still expect we'll be building decks around this card because it seems really strong, and plus it's a turtle, and turtles are sweet. Next up, we get a new Izzet legendary vehicle, the Belligerent, which appears to be a boat that is driving over a waterfall, which I guess kind of describes what this card does, because I think a lot of the times you're going to attack with it once to get a little value out of it, and it's going to die. 4 mana 5/5 legendary vehicle. It's 3 to crew. It says when it attacks, you make a treasure token, and then until end of turn, you can look at the top card of your library anytime, and you can play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. So the Belligerent, if you think about what this is, you essentially attack with it and get a Decadent Dragon style attack trigger. You get a treasure token, nice little bonus, and then you get a future sight until the end of your turn. You can play off the top of your library for 1 turn. Is this going to be enough for this card to see play? And I gotta say, I'm pretty skeptical. We don't really have a long track record of 4 mana vehicles that are on the ground really seeing play in Standard. Like, I guess Azika's Chariot is the one exception, although that's like kind of cheating because it just had so many bodies to the battlefield. Like, that's what made Azika's Chariot good, is the 2 cat tokens, not the vehicle mode. So if we discount Azika's Chariot as the one exception, we got cards like Surge Hacker Mech, Golden Argosy, maybe the best example, Horde Hauler, has been in Standard for a while now, a 4 mana 5/5 vehicle with trample, crew 3, so basically same setup. When it deals combat damage, you get to create a treasure for each artifact your opponent controls. That has seen literally 0 play, so I think the Belligerent is better than Horde Hauler, but Horde Hauler has been so far away from playability that I think this is probably just not a card that shows up anywhere. I guess if you do want to build around it, we still have Kamigawa in Standard, so we do have a bunch of vehicle synergies. We got Mech Titan Core, you got Mech Hanger and Mobilizer Mech to crew it up without having creatures, you got Anchor to Reality to tutor it up, and it is a sweet effect, like a treasure, and playing off the top of your deck for a turn is nice, but I gotta say, I think I'm kind of skeptical of this one actually seeing play. It seems like a fun, sort of flavorful, casual card, but I would be very surprised if this legendary vehicle actually made an impact on 60 card formats. We also got our Gruul creature land in Restless Ridgeline. So this one, like the rest of them, comes into play tapped. It makes a red or green. You can pay for to turn it into a 3/4 red and green dinosaur creature token until end of turn, and when it attacks, another target attacking creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn, and you get to untap it. So Restless Ridgeline, this one I'm not sure about. So if you compare this to past creature lands, it's essentially like a Stirring Wildwood, a 3/4, except it's 1 more to turn into a creature. If you compare it to Raging Ravine, the original Gruul creature land, it's 4 to activate, but Raging Ravine turns into a 4/4 when it attacks and keeps growing with counters each turn. I think that Restless Ridgeline, I'm thinking it's a little bit worse than these. I do like the pump and untap another creature mode. I think that's really the selling point. Although I will say, when it comes down to it, I mean, it's a land, and if you're playing a deck that can afford to play Enter the Battlefield tap land in its colors, you're probably going to run a few copies because it's just such good free value. And these lands are especially important in current Standard because there's so many powerful sweepers, the Sunfalls and the Farewells, and having lands that can turn into creatures is one of the few ways you can actually build your deck to play around those effects. One concern I do have with this card, though, is if you look at competitive Gruul decks in Standard, they tend to be pretty aggro. Like the most popular Gruul decks are kind of like Monastery, Swift Spear, almost spell slingery style aggro decks, and those are the decks that can least afford to actually play a tap land, so that might cut one potential home off of Restless Ridgeline's list. On the other hand, we're getting a bunch of dinosaurs, and this turns into a dinosaur, and if you have dinosaur synergies, this card gets even better. And dinosaurs tend to be kind of mid-rangey, they can afford to play some tap lands, so I think that might be the best home for this deck. Also worth mentioning, its pump ability, it's kind of just free value. Like, you get to pump something else, you get to untap it so it can be back on defense, or maybe it's a mana dork and you can make some more mana with it post-combat or something. It also works really well with Sovereign and Nekiahu, which we talked about yesterday, because Sovereign just wants you to pump creatures' base toughness. I believe that you can stack the triggers in a way so Restless Ridgeline will pump first, and then Sovereigns will trigger after, so you're going to give a creature +2 power thanks to Restless Ridgeline, and then Sovereigns will put 2+1/+1 counters on that creature. So maybe there's some sort of like Naya modified deck that can take advantage of both of these together. Would be actually be pretty powerful. So Restless Ridgeline, I mean, I like all these creature lands. They're definitely not busted, but again, in a standard that's very wrath heavy, very removal heavy, having creatures in your mana base is a really powerful effect. So it might not make it in like Gruul Egg or whatever, but if you're playing a more mid-rangey Jund style deck or dinosaur Gruul deck, then I think Restless Ridgeline, really solid option for your mana base. We also got our Azorius creature land, and I think this might be the best of the Ixalan ones we've seen so far, and that's Restless Anchorage. So Restless Anchorage comes into play tap, makes blue or white. You can pay 3 to turn it into a 2/3 white and blue bird creature with flying, and when it attacks, you make a map token. So why do I think this card is the best of the cycle? There's actually 1, 2, 3, I guess 3.5 reasons. Let's go 4 reasons. There's 4 reasons I think this card is good. Number 1, it turns into an evasive creature, which is nice. You can swing in over the Shieldreds of the world and get in some damage. 2, it's only 3 mana to activate, which is about as cheap as we see activated abilities cost on these dual land creature lands. So it's a really, really cheap rate, not like 4 mana or 5 mana like some of the other ones. So that's a nice bonus. The map, I think, is also a nice bonus. It's adding an artifact to the battlefield. You can use it to filter. You can use it to like pseudo surveil. Maybe you can even draw a card. The other reason, and maybe the biggest reason I think this card is going to be really good, is it has the most homes. When we were talking about the Gruul creature land, one of the concerns is, well, is there a home for it? Gruul decks want to be aggro. Do they want to tap land? Well, there are plenty of blue-white based, slow control, mid-range control style decks that are gonna want this land. We have like the Rafine Esper style decks that could play it. We have just straight up blue-white control and Esper control and Bat control that could easily want this evasive creature land. Could maybe even put it in Soldiers. Soldiers is the place I'm least excited for it, just because I don't know if Soldiers can afford to play a tap land. Like, that might be too punishing to play a tap land in Soldiers, but there's a ton of standard homes because standard's so blue-white heavy right now. So I think this card gonna see a ton of play in standard and be very, very strong. It's just like a really good all-around creature land. We also got a new red legend in it, Seneschal of the Sun, and I probably butchered that pronunciation, but it is a 2 mana 2/2 legendary human knight. It says when you attack, you can discard a card. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains trample until end of turn. And then whenever you discard one or more cards, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until your next end step. This card I think is actually really, really strong. So if you think about what this does, in standard, most obvious home for this is going to be in some sort of mono red deck. This is like the way souped up, super way a million times better Conspiracy Theorist. I don't know what went wrong with Conspiracy Theorist. That card just never really made it. In it is like Conspiracy Theorist plus a million. So what do you do with this card? Well, option number 1, you just jam it in mono red. If you think about what this card does, it says when you attack, not when it attacks. So you can turn 1, play your Phoenix Chick. Turn 2, you drop this. You attack with your Phoenix Chick. You can discard a card, turn your Phoenix Chick into a 2/2 and give it trample until end of turn. That's already pretty sweet. It works well with itself. Like, I know it looks like a grizzly bear. It's a 2/2 for 2, but if you attack with it, you can put the counter on it, give it trample, turn it into a 3/2, so it grows your team, which is exactly what a really aggressive red deck wants. Also importantly, this also keeps you churning through your deck. Like, you're not just discarding a card for no value, you're discarding a card to impest draw until your next end step, which is also a really strong effect. So you're able to get rid of extra lands, let's say, to find more action. You're able to discard your Phoenix Chick, because you're going to put it back into play later from your graveyard anyway, to try to find more action. So there's tons of flexibility here. If you look at red decks in standard, right now the big 2 in the 2-drop slot are Charming Scoundrel, Bloodthirsty Adversary, and then you see some number of Feldons as well. I think that in it, is in this package. I don't know how many you play, because it is legendary. A lot of times with Feldon, which is also legendary, even though it's really strong, you see like 1 or 2 copies, and it might be the same in mono red and standard. It's not a card you want to draw 4 of, because it is going to get clunky, although the fact that you can discard extras is a nice bonus. It does help get around the legend rule in a weird way, because if you draw too many, you can always just discard them to the ability. But I think this certainly 1,000,000% mono red playable, going to be very, very good in mono red and standard. It also has some additional upside. So we have some archetypes in standard that specifically care about cards being played from exile. We have like Pia Nalar, we have Quintorius Khan now. They want you to play things from exile, and it's a way you can get things in exile to play. So it synergizes really well with like Pia, Quintorius Khan. We've seen these Reckless Impulse, Rend Resolves decks. So this feels like another really nice addition there. Also, of course, there's decks that just want to fill the graveyard. Maybe you're trying to reanimate something. This can discard your Atraxa, so you can Cruelty of Gixit. In older formats, maybe you're playing Madness and like intentionally discarding your Fiery Temper to Lightning Bolt something, and you get to impulse draw another card within it as well. So this card's just kind of ridiculous, and this works whenever you discard a card. That's the other important note here. Like, its second ability, it's not whenever it attacks and makes you discard a card. They're not tied together. It's whenever you discard a card in any way. So what this means is, if you channel Beseju, you're discarding that. You're going to impulse draw a card until your next end step. Maybe you cycle a Triome. That's discarding a card. That's going to impulse draw a card. Maybe you got a looter like Malcolm, which when it deals combat damage, allows you to discard a card, draw a card. That's going to trigger in it. Maybe you got Jaxus, which lets you discard a card to copy something. That's going to trigger in it. So when you really think about all the different ways you can discard cards, this card actually gets way more exciting. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Harnfeld, the horn on the backside of Burgi, which lets you discard a card to exile the top 2 cards of your library. You can play them this turn, and it's kind of like the mini creature version of that. You do need a way to discard. You need a discard outlet, but if you build your deck with Seismic Assault, Zombie Infestation, some sort of repeatable discard effect, this can get out of control really, really quickly. You discard a land to Seismic Assault to deal 2 damage, impulse draw a card, then you can play that card, keep churning through your deck. Same with Zombie Infestation. So I think this card is really, really powerful. In Commander, of course, everyone's going to say, good in Prosper. And yes, it probably is good in Prosper. Yes, it's probably good in Rocco. If the whole gimmick of your deck is impulse drawing and playing things from exile, sure, fine, yes, put it in your deck. That's great. But I think there might be even better homes, which is commanders that allow you to discard cards. So maybe the most obvious, most busted home is going to be Annie Falconwrath. Annie just taps to let you discard a card to draw a card. If you discard a Mantis card, you get to untap it, and it's going to be ridiculous there. Yes, I know it's not a vampire, which might be a little bit awkward, but if you're not trying to do vampire things in just like a generic Madness style deck, and it seems insane. You tap your commander, discard a card, draw a card, but then you also get to impulse draw a card within it, and then if you cast a Madness card, you do it again. Like, you're going to combo off and just like churn through your entire deck. It works with Jaya Ballard or Gallia, these other commanders that have you discard. I imagine there's even some combo potential. I haven't figured out the full-on like infinite combo yet, but I would not be surprised if there was a way for this to like either go fully infinite or go functionally infinite. On the other hand, this doesn't work well in every self-discard style deck. So where it's actually not great is in wheel style decks or mass discard decks like Nekuzar. You might think, oh, I'm like drawing and discarding all the time. I'm wheeling. That's what I do with Nekuzar. The thing is, the way Intent's worded, it's whenever you discard 1 or more cards, you exile the top card of your library and play it. So if you're discard your entire hand to a Wheel of Fortune and draw 7 cards, even if you discarded 7 cards, you still only impulse draw once. You're going to be much better off Annie Falconwrathing again and again and again to impulse draw a bunch of times than Melfragoring and discarding your entire hand and impulse drawing once. So in it, I think this card is actually just like really, really strong. Have to figure out what the combo is, but I think this card definitely going to be super good in standard mono red style decks, and it has all that additional upside of impulse drawing, play from exile synergies. I think there'll be commander homes for it, and I would not be surprised if there was some eternal home for this card where it's just absolutely like comboing off, going infinite busted. So in it, don't sleep on this one. It might look like a grizzly bear, but this card might secretly be kind of busted. Speaking of maybe secretly busted, we also got another new flip into a land artifact, a red one in Brass's Tunnel Grinder / Tekultin the Searing Rift. So front side of this card, 3-mana legendary artifact. When ETBs, discard any number of cards and then draw that many +1. And then it says at the beginning of your end step, if you descend to this turn, put a board counter on it. And if there's 3 or more board counters, remove them and transform it into Teculin the Searing Rift, which is an absurd land. It's a legendary cave. It taps to add a red. Most importantly, when you cast a permanent spell using its mana, you discover X where X is that spell's mana value. So what this means is you get a land that cascades anytime you use its mana to cast a permanent, essentially. So if you cast a 5-drop with this, you're going to cascade 5. If you cast a 1-drop, you're going to cascade 1. I know Discover instead of Cascade. Discover is actually like better as Cascade. Isn't this card actually kind of bonkers and ridiculous? Like, I feel like this card's absurd. The first thing I thought of is, oh, this is Valakut Awakening. Like, Valakut Awakening's the 3-mana red MDFC that lets you do the same kind of card drawing. The upside is it's an instant, I guess, but discard any number of cards, draw that many +1. So the front sides, I guess, like, Brass's Tunnel Grinder's worse because it's got to be sorcery speed because it's an artifact rather than an instant. But the thing about Valakut Awakening is the backside's just a land that makes red mana. The backside of this is ridiculous. It's like, it's ridiculous. It's one of the most powerful lands we've seen, a land that's gonna let you cascade every single turn assuming you cast a permanent spell, and it doesn't seem that hard to actually get to this. So if you think about Brass's Tunnel Grinder, if you play it fairly, you cast it, you do your looting effect, you hopefully discard a permanent, so that's gonna be your first descend counter, and then for the next 2 turns, you gotta also descend, get something to go in your graveyard, and then you get to flip it. But there's ways you can really speed this up. The backside reminds me of like Primal Wellspring, but for permanents and Cascade. Think about Standard though, we have Proliferate in Standard. So if you want to speed up Brass's Tunnel Grinder, you can turn 1, use its looting effect to be able to descend the first time and get a counter on it. Turn 2, get in with Cacophony Scomp and sacrifice it and Proliferate. That's counter number 2, and that's also a permanent going in the graveyard, so that's going to descend on your end step. That's counter number 3, flips around, ridiculous Cascade land. Cankerbloom can do the same trick. You can just sack it to Proliferate, so that's going to actually be 2 counters, 1 proliferated, 1 because you descended. Well, you got Volt Charge, you got Staff of Completion. So there's ways you can really speed this up if you want to. Beyond that, I don't think there's any requirements for this card. Like, why wouldn't you just run this? Like, in Commander, you can throw this in any red deck. Valakut Awakening is an MDFC. I play in literally every red deck, because why not? It's a land that can also filter when I need it to. This is like Valakut Awakening plus. So I feel like this card is just absolutely ridiculous, maybe kind of broken. Oh yeah, the other thing I didn't mention compared to Valakut Awakening, this puts the cards in your graveyard rather than back in your library, which is actually a huge upside because it's stocking your graveyard for all your synergies and stuff. So Brass's Tunnel Grinder, we'll see what it does in Standard. Like, sure, you can just kill it with the removal spell. Sure, it's a little slow, but if you actually flip around in the backside of this, Brass's Tunnel Grinder seems absolutely ridiculous. So this card, my goodness, do I plan on playing a lot of it. This card is so sweet. This set's so sweet. In Box Topper World, just got one so far today in Fist of Suns, which honestly, one of the ones you probably don't want to open. It's only like $3 or $4. So it is kind of a cool card, letting you play all your spells for 5 colors of mana rather than their mana cost. In the world of lower rarity cards, got a handful that are good enough to mention individually. First off, Pit of Offering. So this is a cave land. ETBs tapped. When it ETBs, you can exile 3 cards from graveyards. It makes a colorless mana, or it makes 1 mana of any of the exiled cards' colors. So I think this card's actually very good. Like, it's kind of a Scavenger Grounds Paducah Bog effect, like giving you a land that's graveyard hate. But unlike these other lands, this can also be really good mana fixing. Like, if you're a 5-color deck and can exile a 5C card, this is a painless City of Brass that ETBs tapped. So you get a lot of upside with the color fixing as well, where maybe you play this and like snipe a couple of things from your opponent's graveyard and 1 from your graveyard to give you some color fixing and just go to town. We also got an uncommon pirate legend in Captain Storm Cosmium Raider. So 2 mana 2/2 legendary human pirate. It says when an artifact ETBs under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target pirate you control. So this card plays really well with the treasure theme of pirates. So the first thing I thought is, My god, Dockside Extortionist. Dockside Extortionist, you know what it does. I'm sure you know what it does. ETBs makes like 1,000,000 treasures. Well, if you make 1,000,000 treasures with Dockside Extortionist, now you also get 1,000,000 +1/+1 counters with Captain Storm, which seems kind of bonkers. Actually, it might be a positive thing, because now maybe the Dockside player will actually just kill me rather than dirtling for 20 minutes as I sit there and twiddle my thumbs. So maybe it's actually merciful that this will make Dockside into a lethal threat, but this also could maybe be like a Pioneer card, maybe a standard card. There's a lot of pirates that make treasures. You got like Captain Lannery Storm makes treasures when it attacks. When all of your treasures are actually adding a +1/+1 counter to a pirate, they become much more threatening. If you really want to build around it, you also got cheap artifacts like Mox Amber. We've talked about Soul Guide Lantern a lot, maybe being necessary to our new standard format in the main deck. Captain Storm plays with all of that as well. So even though this is an uncommon, I think there could be a home for this. Definitely in Pirate Commander decks, but also maybe in Pioneer and maybe in Standard as well. We also got Confounding Riddle, 3-mana instant. Choose one. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, snag one for your hand, the rest in the graveyard, or counter target spell unless its controller pays 4. This is basically an upgraded Supreme Will. So Supreme Will actually saw a bunch of play in its time. I still occasionally see it in some Pioneer decks and Explorer decks. Confounding Riddle is just a very upgraded version. The upgrade, you're probably thinking, okay, like the counter is a little better, right? You got to play 4 instead of pay 3. That is an upgrade, and that is like sort of relevant in the late game. The real upgrade here, though, is Supreme Will puts the rest of the cards in the bottom of your library. Confounding Riddle dumps them into your graveyard. In a format where we're going to be descending and trying to fill our graveyard, this is really relevant. Plus, even like the Pioneer decks that would want this, sometimes they're like Torrential Gearhulk style decks, where dumping cards in your graveyard is just going to be incredibly more valuable than putting them back in your library. Plus, you have like Delve spells, Treasure Cruises, Dig Through Times, all that kind of stuff. This fuels those as well. So I think Confounding Riddle might be enough of an upgrade on Supreme Will. I think it probably doesn't really make it a modern, but you never know. We also got a card that I'm honestly surprised was printed, Helping Hand. So Helping Hand, 1 mana sorcery, return target creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So why is this random uncommon exciting? Well, this is essentially Unearth, a card that sees play all the way back to modern. You do lose the cycling, but this is essentially Unearth in white, and I am shocked that Wizards printed this. So if you think about what this card really does, it's actually Dark Ritual with extra step. Dark Ritual, like iconic, overpowered card. 1 mana to make 3 mana. Helping Hands does the same thing. This is 1 mana, make 3 mana worth of creatures from your graveyard. If you look at more recent versions of this, they're almost always 2 mana. 2 mana to get back a creature mana value 3 or less. That's like the safe way to do it. You're only gaining 1 mana. The fact that this goes from 1 to 3 is a huge, not to be understatedly huge advantage compared to other versions of this. So I'm honestly surprised. I thought Wizards has just like crossed Unearth off their list because it generated too much mana, but they brought it back. Sure, the creature enter taps, you can't cycle it, so it's watered down in some ways, but I still think this card is really good and will definitely serve a purpose. You got Greasefang decks in Pioneer and Explorer and Historic. You got Lurrus decks in Historic. That could even show up all the way back to Modern and Legacy. Like, it is a really efficient card. Finally today, we got some draft shaft, of course, but you can see all that over at MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers for today. So let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow for even more Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, make sure to check out the video where we taught Arena Zoomers about paying the one, and you can also find yesterday's spoiler video right over here.